They ridiculed him for daring to touch a wealthy student's piano, yet when his fingertips pressed against the ivory, everyone in the room became still. Elijah Brooks rarely spoke, not from shyness. He simply couldn't see any purpose in filling silence when it seemed nobody was listening anyway. His home was on the western part of Baton Rouge, close to Florida Boulevard, in a tight, small two-bedroom flat, where the partitions were paper-thin and the people next door were unnecessarily loud. His mother Charlene worked consecutive shifts at a neighborhood clinic, while his elder brother Isaiah devoted most of his time with people. Elijah found suspicious, but for Elijah, there was music, not an expensive instrument or some cutting-edge equipment, merely an old damaged keyboard at the community center. Just down the road, half of the keys were broken, and the wire would spark dangerously if moved incorrectly. But for Elijah, this was sufficient. Every day following classes he would hurry over, fingers eager to play without musical notation or formal training. Just melodies he carried within his mind and soul. He performed what he experienced at times: happiness, at times fury, at times quietness. Nobody had instructed him, but certain abilities don't require instruction. They simply emerge. In school, Elijah remained inconspicuous. He wasn't a troublemaker, but neither was he exceptional. Teachers frequently overlooked how he tapped beats with his pencil during mathematics, or how his expression brightened when the daily announcements broadcast the school song. Most students paid him no attention except when seeking to copy answers or find an easy target for teasing. His single genuine escape came through Miss Delacroix, his music instructor at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle. She was the only grown-up who appeared to recognize him as more than his reserved nature. She would notice him humming during meal times, keep him after lessons, and pose questions that challenged him about harmonies, musical progressions, how to convey a narrative with your fingers rather than your voice. You perceive sound differently than most people, Elijah, she told him once after he spontaneously composed a cradle song for a hypothetical infant assignment. Never abandon that gift. He had no intentions to. Then one Thursday before spring vacation, the school revealed a collaborative event with Bayside Prep, an exclusive private institution across the city. It was described as a community arts exchange, meaning Elijah's class would dedicate a day participating in workshops and viewing student performances at the other institution. Most children sighed with displeasure. Elijah straightened in his seat. Bayside Prep. He'd heard stories about it. Expansive grounds, matching outfits, a dining hall offering sushi. Gossip suggested their music department featured a grand piano in each classroom. Elijah couldn't imagine such luxury. He'd never felt a genuine piano before. He had observed one previously, though at the downtown theater, when his class received complimentary tickets to the symphony. It shimmered beneath the spotlight like something from another world. He barely heard that performance. He was too engrossed watching the pianist's movements. Now he had an opportunity to witness one firsthand. Perhaps even play if nobody was observing. Charlene pressed his finest shirt, the evening before the excursion, despite a tiny mark near the sleeve. "You mind your manners," she said without looking up from her task. "Don't go showing me up in front of those individuals." "I won't. Don't handle anything you're not supposed to." He agreed. He genuinely meant it too. But music had a tendency to make him disregard restrictions. However, Elijah had no awareness of how greatly one error, or perhaps one act of bravery, was about to transform everything. The coach journey to Bayside Prep lasted just 30 minutes, yet it felt as if Elijah had entered an alternative universe. As the vehicle passed through the metal entrance, he gazed from the window at lines of precisely trimmed bushes, water features that functioned properly, and structures that resembled galleries, more than learning spaces. Youths in identical dark blue jackets gathered in clusters, chuckling in the manner of those who needn't worry about what might occur. The following day, everything appeared excessively pristine, too motionless. Even the pathways seemed costly. Elijah trailed behind his classmates, exiting the bus, clutching his backpack strap. He remained largely silent, just absorbing the view of a yard with a copper figure at its middle, some founder holding a parchment in one hand, and a conceited smile etched into his visage. Inside, the ground gleamed like crystal, the corridors smelled of citrus polish and crisp stationery. No vandalism, no fractured floor pieces, no educators shouting from the corridor's end, simply hushed self-assurance. He proceeded with the group, past exhibitions of student artwork, mounted as if belonging in an exhibition. One creation had an actual price label, $200. Elijah stared. He could sketch as well, but nobody had ever proposed to purchase his drawings. They were guided into an assembly hall, where the Bayside students were already positioned in organized rows. An elderly gentleman, with grey hair, greeted them with the identical tone people employ in religious settings. He mentioned several things regarding harmony and artistic expression, and termed the gathering a celebration of ability from diverse backgrounds. Elijah surveyed the room, and tallied among everyone present. He was one of perhaps 5 black attendees. Most of the Bayside youth looked as if they'd never gone without sustenance, never heard the phrase, "not today," never needed to delay until payday for fresh hosiery. They viewed a brief performance by the Bayside Jazz Ensemble. It was proficient, polished, practiced, even remarkable, but something about it seemed rehearsed in a manner that caused Elijah's heart to constrict, not because he lacked sufficient skill, because he recognized his own talent. But no one here would accept that unless he demonstrated it. They divided into separate sessions. Elijah was designated to a composition workshop in room 208. He walked there alongside a group of unfamiliar students, remaining quiet, while others cracked jokes about cafeteria fare, and whose luxury vehicle their parents operated. Room 208 was indeed a music room, but unlike the one at his school, this one featured ceiling-high windows, insulated walls, and instruments arranged in perfect order: guitars, violins, a cello in the corner. But what captured Elijah's attention was the piano, a lustrous ebony Steinway, grand, larger than any instrument he'd ever handled. The cover was raised, the keys gleaming like ivory. The facilitator hadn't shown up yet, and most participants took places with minimal interest. Elijah didn't. He lingered by the partition, gaze fixed on the piano, as if it challenged him. Then he detected a voice behind him. "Don't even consider it." He turned. A lofty youth, with slick-back blonde locks, was observing him, accompanied by 2 others, who appeared to practice frowning before mirrors. The tall one wore a personalized blazer, PJW embroidered on the breast. "That's my father's contribution," the boy added. "Got anything similar in your neighborhood?" Elijah blinked, uncertain if the youngster was being earnest or simply attempting to provoke a response. "I wasn't planning to damage it." "You certain about that?" The boy sneered. "Careful, those keys aren't designed for soiled fingers." The statement struck like a blow. The classroom grew quieter. Several other pupils turned to observe. Elijah felt warmth rise to his ears, but remained motionless. His palms stayed beside his body. The piano appeared more distant now, as if it had moved into another realm. Part of him wished to exit. Another portion wanted to respond, but he doubted his ability to speak steadily. But then someone behind him chuckled, and that was sufficient for something within Elijah to shift. Elijah couldn't recall making the choice. One moment, he stood immobile, cheeks flushed and pulse racing, and the next he was advancing toward the piano. The sneer on the blonde boy's face wavered slightly. His companions exchanged glances as if incredulous at what they witnessed. Elijah didn't hesitate. He drew the seat out with both hands and lowered himself gradually, as if he possessed all the time on earth. His palms were moist, his throat parched, but his digits didn't tremble. The classroom was hushed, not completely silent, but still like an inhalation held excessively long. The instructor hadn't entered yet. Perhaps that was fortunate. Perhaps it was destiny. Elijah elevated his hands above the keys. Then he paused, because this wasn't the broken keyboard from the community center. This was authentic. This was substance. This was resonance that traveled, and reverberated, and occupied a space not due to loudness, but due to presence. He could sense every gaze upon his spine. He could hear Preston's words reverberating inside his thoughts. Soiled fingers, as if his complexion had somehow tainted the atmosphere. He inhaled once more, and depressed the initial key, a basic C, gentle, pure. It resounded as if it had been anticipating him. Then followed an E, then G. He constructed the chord the way he always did. By instinct. Nobody instructed him how, and nobody needed to. Music was the sole thing that ever made sense without requiring explanation. He allowed his left hand to follow walking bass notes, subtle, initially, then more powerful. Then the right hand returned, crafting a melody over the rhythm. Something recognizable, yet unfinished. It was the tune he perpetually played when alone, the one he'd never titled, because it felt too intimate a song that didn't require lyrics to express what he couldn't. The classroom began to transform. Discussions ceased. Seats squeaked as individuals leaned closer. The two youths who stood behind Preston no longer seemed entertained. They looked bewildered. Preston remained speechless, but his lips tightened, and Elijah, he didn't even notice anymore. He wasn't performing for them. He was performing for those evenings he spent isolated in his chamber, listening to the noises of his urban environment outside his pain. He was performing for those Sabbaths when his mother moved to spiritual songs at worship, eyelids shut, countenance relaxed for once. He was performing for that version of himself that had never been instructed. Don't touch that. The melody intensified. His hands moved more rapidly now, assured and precise. It wasn't flawless. He missed a note, faltered on a chord, but it was inconsequential. It was authentic, dynamic, the sort of performance that didn't request authorization. When he concluded, the classroom didn't react immediately. There was a silence, the kind that typically succeeds a powerful impact. Then a female near the rear released a soft "whoa." Another pupil applauded. Several others joined. Preston remained immobile. His fists were clenched at his sides. That wasn't terrible, one of his friends murmured, but Elijah detected something additional in his tone. It was admiration. The entrance creaked open. The facilitator finally appeared, carrying a clipboard. She halted mid-step, glancing from Elijah to the astonished class. "Did I miss something?" she inquired. A child near the front nodded slowly. "Yeah, you did." Elijah rose unhurriedly, pushing the bench back to its original position. He remained silent. He didn't need to speak. For once the quietness wasn't uncomfortable. It was deserved, but just as Elijah believed it had concluded, he rotated and discovered something awaiting him in the corridor that he hadn't anticipated whatsoever. Elijah moved into the hallway, his torso still constricted from excitement, uncertain whether to feel accomplished or fearful. He hadn't intended to play. He hadn't even known if he was capable, but he succeeded, and now everything seemed altered. That's when he noticed them. A modest crowd had assembled outside the music chamber, pupils from other sessions, several educators, all attracted by the sound. Some appeared inquisitive, others astounded, a few even impressed. But the one visage Elijah immediately focused on was Miss Delacroix. She positioned herself near the rear, her palm covering her mouth. Not in astonishment, but in something else, something more tender. Her vision shone in a manner that made Elijah lower his gaze momentarily. She approached him gradually. "You truly performed that?" she asked softly. He confirmed with a nod. "That music was yours." He nodded again, almost reluctant to affirm it vocally. She looked beyond him into the classroom, then back at him. "Elijah, that wasn't merely good. That was something individuals remember." He was speechless. He hadn't contemplated being memorable. He simply desired to touch the keys, hear their sound, when played without apprehension. Another educator approached. Someone unfamiliar, a statuesque woman in a charcoal blazer, clipboard secured under her limb. She bent slightly to meet his gaze. "I'm Mrs. Coldwell," she stated. "I manage the progressive music curriculum here. I heard you from down the corridor." He parted his lips but produced no sound. She didn't seem concerned. "Have you ever received instruction?" He shook his head. "Where did you acquire such playing ability?" "Just practicing," he replied. "I play at the community center occasionally, and at home when my sibling permits me to use his earphones." She smiled. "Well, you possess something exceptional, that variety of hearing, that variety of expression. You can't instruct that, you direct it, you foster it." Behind her, Preston eventually emerged from the classroom, his jacket wrinkled from leaning against the partition too extensively. He examined the gathering, then concentrated on Elijah. Their gazes connected, but neither uttered a word. One of Preston's companions whispered something and snickered, but Preston didn't respond. His expression was difficult to interpret now. Not irate, not arrogant, just undecided. Miss Delacroix intervened. "Elijah, how would you feel about performing something at the concluding presentation this afternoon?" He glanced up suddenly. "Me? Yes. They always reserve space for one guest pupil to share something at the closing. I believe no. I know. You should participate." He studied the ground, then Mrs. Coldwell, then back to Miss Delacroix. A surge of anxiety struck him like a secondary blow. Performing once in a classroom, Was one matter playing before the entire auditorium? I don't know, he mumbled. You aren't obligated, Miss Delacour stated kindly, but I believe you'll regret it if you decline. He recognized her accuracy. He agreed hesitantly. Okay. The educators began to disperse. The corridor, clearing the moment, reintegrating into the day. Elijah followed Miss Delacour as she guided him toward the concert hall. His movements deliberate, the passageway impossibly extended, but something within him had transformed now. It wasn't self-assurance, not precisely. It was nearer to conviction, like when a melody plays, and you already anticipate where the notes proceed, even if you've never encountered it. Previously Preston lingered behind solitary near the entrance. Elijah, he said softly. Elijah rotated. Preston looked as if he wanted to express something, perhaps to retract his earlier statement, perhaps to behave as if none of it transpired. But instead, he merely offered the slightest shrug and departed. But as Elijah entered the auditorium, later that afternoon, he had no awareness. Who else would be watching from concealment? And how profoundly his presentation would resonate beyond that chamber. The auditorium appeared more illuminated than Elijah recollected. He stood behind the draped pulse, racing, observing the lustrous stage surface. Rows of seating stretched outward beyond the platform, already partially occupied. Students entered with refreshments and programs, jesting and browsing on their devices. Several educators positioned themselves near the rear, conversing in hushed tones. Everything seemed casual, except to Elijah. He wore the identical crumpled garment from that morning, perspiration beginning to dampen the neckline. His fingers quivered marginally, not from anxiety about performing. He trusted his hands. It was the audience, the unfamiliar gazes, the burden of being observed. Miss Delacour materialized beside him, her voice subdued. They're going to adore you. What if I err? He inquired. You won't, and even if you do, they'll still experience it. That provided slight comfort. The student announcer, a tall girl with substantial spectacles and a refined voice, introduced the event's final performance. We'd like to welcome a guest pupil from Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School, Elijah Brooks, with an original piano composition. Courteous applause. Elijah stepped forward. He avoided looking at the spectators, just concentrated on the piano waiting at center stage. It glistened beneath the illumination just as before, as if it recognized him now. He sat, took one inhalation, let his fingers locate their position, and he performed. It wasn't the identical melody as earlier. This one was more measured, more hushed, more deliberate, like correspondence written aloud. It commenced with the sort of anguish. You cannot identify something in the intervals between notes, the way certain harmonies lingered longer than expected. Then it changed, grew more intimate, more courageous, like something struggling to achieve independence. Every measure narrated a fragment of him. The evenings alone in his chamber, the sound of his mother supplicating in the kitchen, when she believed he slumbered, the manner in which the community center, the keyboard occasionally sparked, but continued to function throughout. Stillness fell over the room, as even the teachers ceased their murmurs. Mobile devices were lowered, and gazes were raised. Somewhere during the latter portion, the sentiment behind his melody overwhelmed him. His heart tightened, and his vision blurred with tears, yet his fingers remained steady. He continued playing until the conclusion. When the final tone disappeared, he raised his hands, gradually, as if releasing something substantial. Quiet followed, then a solitary applause, followed by another, then the entire audience joined in. The applause was genuine and robust, not rehearsed. A few students rose to their feet. A teacher dabbed at her eye. Even the host appeared taken aback. Elijah stood, bowed instinctively, then exited the stage rapidly, before the audience could approach him. In the corridor, he rested against the wall, breathing heavily. Then a voice. That was remarkable. He turned. Preston. His jacket was fastened now, his hair slightly tidier, but his arrogance had vanished. This time he wasn't surrounded by companions. I didn't realize you were capable of such performance, he remarked. Elijah remained silent. Preston shifted uncomfortably. What I expressed earlier, I was inappropriate. Still, Elijah didn't respond. I suppose I simply wasn't expecting it. Elijah observed him, then said softly, you weren't obligated to. Preston nodded once. True, and that concluded it. No significant moment, no handshake, just an uncomfortable pause, and two young men, standing in a corridor too vast for either of them, Miss Delacroix emerged, beaming. You succeeded. He managed a breathless chuckle. I believe I did. She gazed at him for an extended moment. Let's converse later. There's an individual I'd like to introduce you to. But what Elijah was unaware of was that someone in the audience had already placed a call, one that would create an opportunity he never imagined possible for him. By the time the coach returned to Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School's parking area, the horizon was streaked with amber. Elijah was seated near the rear, his forehead pressed against the window, observing Baton Rouge pass by in fragments, fast food establishments, filling stations, neighborhood stores, recognizable once more, comfortable yet somehow diminished now. He hadn't conversed much during the journey. Some classmates congratulated him. A few inquired how he acquired such piano skills. One boy, Jermeri, even jested. Man, you got wealthy kids to applaud. That's supernatural. Elijah had grinned, but internally, everything still reverberated. Not anxiety, not trepidation, something else he couldn't yet articulate. Miss Delacroix waited at the bottom step, as students descended from the bus. Elijah, she said, gently guiding him aside. That woman I presented to you, Mrs. Coldwell, she wishes to meet with you again. He blinked. Why? She manages a summer arts initiative, scholarship-based. She mentioned it's uncommon to discover someone like you without formal training. He glanced down at his athletic shoes, the left one marked with scuffs. I can't afford instruction. That's precisely the point, Miss Delacroix responded. You wouldn't require finances. All expenses are covered. You simply need to attend and perform. Elijah was speechless. Such chances didn't materialize for children like him, not without complications. I informed her I'd speak with your mother, she added. She'll need to know. That evening at home, Charlene stood in the kitchen, holding the pamphlet in one hand and a partially charred grilled cheese in the other. Her expression revealed little, but her quietness spoke volumes. They're not attempting to exploit him for anything? She finally asked. No, ma'am, Miss Delacroix answered from across the table. It's a genuine opportunity. They've provided this for students throughout the state. Charlene examined the document again. And his accommodation would be where? In supervised dormitories at Baton Rouge School for the Arts. Just for several weeks he'd return home by summer's end. Elijah perched on the sofa's edge, still wearing his backpack. His fingers gripped the straps tightly. His mother stared at him unflinchingly. You desire this? He met her gaze. I believe I do. She exhaled deeply, the kind of sigh she only produced when her thoughts were traveling far ahead of her speech. He's 12, she said softly. Still my child. I'll be cautious, Elijah promised, voice barely audible. You'd better. She looked at Miss Delacroix again. I'll consider it. That was sufficient progress for now. A week later the correspondence arrived. A cream-colored envelope with azure trim. His name typed neatly in the middle. Inside was the formal invitation. Elijah perused it 3 times before passing it to his mother. She initially said nothing, merely nodded, then returned it without comment. He organized his belongings in a duffel bag. That was oversized for his frame. Miss Delacroix personally drove him to the campus. During the journey, she described other youngsters who had participated in the program. Some who had never even handled a proper instrument prior to their first lesson, others who had advanced to institutions like Juilliard and Berkeley. But none of them possessed your sound, she said, and I mean that sincerely. The campus wasn't similar to Bayside. It wasn't gleaming, it wasn't luxurious, but it felt authentic. The music department had paint flaking on the windowsills and seating polished smooth from years of waiting students. He appreciated that. His inaugural day, he performed for 3 instructors. They didn't inquire about his background. They asked which key he felt most comfortable in. He replied D minor. They nodded as if they comprehended. By the conclusion of the first week, he had composed 3 new pieces. By the end of the second, he was instructing a fellow student how to navigate through chord progressions with intuition, rather than calculation. One evening after the meal, his instructor joined him in the practice space. Do you know what I told my spouse after I heard your performance? She inquired. Elijah shook his head. That's the appearance of talent when it's unrestrained. But even with new possibilities in his grasp, and doors opening wide, Elijah still had one more task to complete before any of it felt authentic. It was October when Elijah re-entered Bayside Prep. This time he didn't arrive via school transportation. No matching attire, no excursion permission slip in his rucksack. He arrived independently, invited back by Mrs. Coldwell to participate in the yearly autumn recital. It was her concept, a surprise, a solo presentation from a participant of the summer arts program, a demonstration of what natural ability could transform into with proper nurturing. Elijah had grown slightly taller since spring. His denim pants fit more appropriately, his curls more orderly, and his hands had developed an understated assurance. He still didn't converse extensively, but when he did, people attended to his words. The auditorium appeared exactly as he recalled. Pristine floors, intense illumination, that platform. It no longer seemed overwhelming to him. In the initial row sat Miss Delacroix, her handbag balanced on her lap, eyes gleaming with discreet pride. And beside her, Charlene, wearing her finest shirt, and gripping the edge of her seat, as if it were the only object keeping her anchored. She had initially been uncertain about the performance. "I'm skeptical about what individuals of that status want from children like you," she had stated. Elijah had responded plainly, simply to listen. Now she was present, waiting to listen. The host provided a brief introduction. "Tonight's concluding performer is a young gentleman who reminds us why music remains significant. Please welcome Elijah Brooks." He approached steadily, neither hurriedly nor slowly. The Steinway was positioned there again, anticipating him. This time he didn't pause. The composition he performed was recent, something he'd written a fortnight earlier, influenced by his summer experience. It lacked a title, merely possessed movement. It commenced low, measured like counted footsteps, then ascended bar by bar, into something more fervent, more definite. There were ornamentations, indeed, but nothing ostentatious. Every element had intention, notes cascaded like thoughts forming mid-sentence, sincere, authentic. Midway through, he glanced upward. Preston occupied a seat 3 rows back, arms crossed, observing. They hadn't exchanged words since that corridor encounter, but Elijah didn't require conversation. The silence between them now wasn't burdensome. It was saturated with comprehension. When the concluding note lingered in the atmosphere, Elijah sustained it just long enough for the breath in the room to catch. Then he elevated his hands. On this occasion the applause arrived swiftly. Not courteous, not tentative, genuine. Charlene rose. She didn't applaud initially, just gazed at her son as if incredulous that he belonged to her. Then quietly she smiled. Following the performance, people approached him, educators, parents, several students. They inquired about his music, his education, his future plans. He answered as effectively as possible, still uncomfortable with excessive attention. But one interaction lingered most prominently. A diminutive boy, perhaps 9, slender with askew spectacles, approached and whispered, "That made me want to attempt piano too." Elijah bent slightly. "You should. I don't know how." "That's irrelevant. Just begin." The boy smiled. That sufficed. Later, as they drove homeward, Charlene was reserved. "Are you well?" Elijah asked. She nodded. "I simply never anticipated witnessing something like that. Not with your name attached to it." He gazed out the window. The streetlights blurred past. "Neither did I," he replied. "But perhaps it was always present." She didn't respond, but her hand extended across the console and rested upon his. That night, Elijah sat at home with a notebook on his knees. He wasn't notating music, just words, scattered thoughts, a phrase he wanted to remember. You don't require an invitation to be permitted. The world hadn't granted him authorization to sit at that piano. He had claimed it, gently, honestly, completely, and in doing so he had reminded them, and himself, that talent doesn't concern itself with your origins, your attire, or your parents' financial contributions. It only concerns itself with your responsiveness when it summons you. So if you're viewing this, and questioning whether you're sufficient, whether you're permitted to attempt, here's your indication. You are. Now proceed.